So this morning, I just want to take a little bit of time to review quickly what we know about dialogue so that we can move towards an exercise of taking what we know about good dialogue and applying it to dialogue with the culture. Some of these things that we put up here yesterday. So we're reminding ourselves that our all-loving Creator God creates life again in the person of Jesus and that mission, that we have a share in that mission, and the mission is to dialogue. And as we participate in dialogue, we are participating in the Spirit's ongoing work of creation, to persons being made new, to the church being made new, to the culture being made new, to the world being made new. Okay? Come in. So that's our umbrella. And so the specifics that we started looking at yesterday is to participate well. We need to have a big picture understanding of dialogue, not simply a one-on-one conversation or a several people conversation. If that's how we narrow it, we're going to be frustrated. It's the whole process that's the dialogue. And so we looked at our part is knowing that if we're going to speak, we need to be able to speak wisely. And so we talked about knowing ourselves and self-examination. And we talked about being able to manage our emotions when we're in dialogue. We talked about all the ways that we kind of prepare ourselves. I was thinking about in the field of communication skills over the years, we've all gone to listening skills workshops. Haven't y'all been to one, forced to one, whatever on your staffs? And I know when I have clients, I say, no, could you just say what you heard? And so the person tries to listen, and I think, before we practice listening skills, we better practice talking skills, because I wouldn't know how to listen to what was said either. Because sometimes when we speak, it's not always very clear, and so it's hard to listen. So that's why we put an emphasis on knowing ourselves so we can speak with some clarity. So then, and some ownership, so then we can move to some of our listening skills and hopefully practice listening more reverently. So that's my few minutes this morning, listening reverently and contemplating the creative process. All of that being part of the movement and steps of dialogue. Okay, so what might listening reverently look like? I think that we all could say, again, and all have probably participated in practicing skills of what's either often referred to as active listening, reflective listening, empathic listening. So this is what I hear you saying. You are saying that you're really angry with the church that they're not, and the diocese, that they're not open to more dialogue and keeping this parish open. Okay, just a simple understanding, I understand that you are excited that there's really going to be change here in the parish, and you're uncertain about where it's going to go. Just all the simple ways that we take time to hear what's said, take it in, and let the other person know we have heard them. So we're familiar with that. Most of us are also familiar with listening as part of the whole self-emptying process, that this is the way that I empty myself so that I might receive the other. So those are 2 points that I think we've heard over and over again. Is that true? Okay. Now here's the third point. Do you practice that skill and that self-giving? Is that a way of life for you? That's part of, I think, the growing in the awareness and the commitment to listening reverently. I have clients all the time. I give them books to read. Here's something you can read, or work with staffs. Here's something you can do. Everybody knows about active listening. Everyone knows we need to self-empty. The next step is, will this become a discipline? Father Nesty and I were part of team teaching a pastoral care class, and I was talking to the students about active listening, reflective listening, and all. And this was actually my group of seminarians here, and so we tried this for about 2 hours, and they were saying, no, this takes too much time. This is ridiculous. Let's get to the point. What they said doesn't make any sense. And I started laughing, and I was saying, I said, yeah, it's a lot of hard work to go slow You have to slow down the process if you're going to use reflective listening. And you really have to practice what you preach about theology is self-emptying, to go slow and put the focus on the other rather than on what you want to say, right? So Father Nestor says, well, Maureen, so how did you learn to do this? I said, when I was in school, we practiced reflective listening for 3 hours a day, 2 days a week for 2 years. Now that's a formation process. That's a formation process. Now I know some of you do this, okay? I'm going to talk about doing it to do it and doing it as a way of life, okay? Listening reverently as a way of life, okay? Not just as a skill, but as a way of life. So, you know, as you're maybe doing a little quick examine for yourself, you might say, yeah, I know that skill. Yeah, I know that's important to do. Is it becoming a way of life? Because frankly, in your families, isn't this a typical thing with your spouse, with your kids, maybe even when you take it to work, take this mindset to work? You go along, you're listening the best you can, and then something happens and there's a conflict and you say, "Arr!" And then finally you say, well, if we're going to get past this, I better listen. And so you back up a little bit and you listen, The point is to be able to keep having that receptive way of being our way of life. Because in the small arena of family and community, it's really detrimental when we don't do that. Look at what happens in the public arena when we don't do that. You know, you're probably, hopefully not going to throw a punch at your spouse or your kid. But boy, the not listening and what happens when we don't listen escalates so much tension and divisive-ness. It becomes so difficult to have a talk in the public arena, if you don't practice at home, you're more likely to chain yourself to a fence when you get to the public arena. Okay? So we're just reminding ourselves of something that we know. It has to be a way of life. Okay, that's something that's familiar to us. That's part of our culture about communication. But I think for us as people of faith, we have to then go beyond that repeating, beyond that just, I heard what you said, to, now I would like to break open what you said. As Father Ben was referring yesterday, to really, the spirituality is to really see the other person as a word that needs to be broken open. So for example, and some of you who've done Marriage Encounter and some of these parenting classes and other retreats, you know what I mean by breaking open. But when your spouse tells you, you know, I really don't like the way that we spend money and the way we do this, or puts things on the table, is your first thought to say, tell me more about that? You know, I just don't like what's happening in our sex life, and something needs to change. Tell me more about that. Okay. Your child says, you know, I think that that's a terrible rule, Mom. You know, you and Dad do this and this. Please tell me more about that. It's not necessarily instinct to say, can you tell me more about that? Is it? Right. But you all have experiences. But when you get a hold of your emotion where you'd like to clobber the person, that's why we talk about differentiation. When someone comes at us with something that's at that border, there needs to be some talking, we are usually, typically, ready to kind of come back. That's why there's so much fighting going on at the border all the time. And so when we can get a hold of our reactivity, we are better able to say, can you tell me more about that? You know, it makes me think of what they say in AA. Even if you don't mean it, fake it till you make it. Just ask it, because it's the right thing to do. The right thing to do in terms of working at dialogue. So can you tell me more about that? Why is this important to you? If you've been on a lot of the different retreats, you see that little gobbledygook of letters. And how does that make you feel? Right? Don't you do that? You get questions all the time. It's trying to say, go deeper, go deeper. And in God's economy, I love to think about God's economy. If I can say to you, okay, you and I are working together on a project, and you are really irritated at me because of what I did or didn't do. I'm going to defend myself, right? Stage 1. Stage 2, okay, I remember, dialogue is important. Can you tell me more about what irritates you about what I do? Stage 2. Why is that important to you? Stage 3. And can you tell me how that makes you feel? Now, what happens as I ask all those questions of the other and invite them to tell their story? What happens? It can diffuse the anger. And not only do I learn you, you are likely going to learn more about yourself. When you ask me those questions, I'm going to go deeper. And so in God's economy, I grow in what I'm saying and change just as you get to know me and I'm getting to know you. So in the end, what we're really trying to come to is, what does this person want me to understand and why? And again, our point in terms of linking personal or spirituality and kind of the intra and interpersonal realm of family and even parish, if we have those skills, or we need to have those skills because they become more necessary as we move out to people who are strangers, but in fact our brothers and sisters we're meant to be collaborating with in terms of the Spirit's work of new culture. Okay, Ben? One of the things that I have really loved and appreciated over the last number of years in communication skills work and working with couples is this very simple idea that may be familiar to some of you, is that whenever there's a conflict, whenever there's a tension, whenever there's the need for dialogue, okay, obviously not all dialogues are about tension, but I'm talking about conversations and dialogue at the border. It's really helpful if you can think of conflict management and dialogue as a two-step process, okay? And what I mean by that is most of us, when we come up against spouse, kid, community member, staff member, parishioner, and there's a tension, usually as we're trying to talk, we're trying to figure out what should change. How should it be, right? This is what my kids should do. No, this is what I should do. This is what my community should do. No, this. We usually start talking to each other with an agenda. And the agenda gets in the way of understanding. And so whenever we teach communication management skills, conflict, problem solving with couples, we say, I want you to sit down 2 or 3 times to talk about this with no intention to coming to a resolution. Because the need to come to a resolution and to solve something gets in the way of just trying to understand. Now, obviously, if you're good at this or you keep practicing this, if you're not good at this, you can learn how to do both in the same conversation, obviously. But for most of us, it's really hard, especially, again, at those border points, to not go in with intention of what ought to happen. And it leaves no room then for me to start thinking different, for you to start thinking different, and if we're both thinking different, then maybe we're open to the Spirit who is thinking completely different than the two of us. So it's really helpful, I think, if we always keep in mind 2 steps when there's tension at the borders, and that is to first go in to learn, to first go in to understand, to first go in to contemplate the other person and what's being said and what's coming up in ourselves, because the primacy then is on the human person. The primacy is not on the change, not on the specific. The primacy is on person. And God loving and creating person in and through us. Then we can move on to, and usually the conflict gets redefined in some ways. So when we come to the second part, rather than an either-or choice, 2 parties are brainstorming now possibilities for their coming together, thereby creating new possibilities that weren't even thought of for growth on both sides. I I was going to have an example, but it's not clear in my mind, so I won't confuse you. Okay, so listening reverently, different pieces of listening reverently, and then the second part of, or which is actually the third part of those 3 steps on creative dialogue, is the next slide, which is to contemplate the creative process. So we're knowing ourselves if we're going to participate effectively in creative dialogue, listening reverently, and all that means, and then developing a contemplative attitude, which again, I know you have examples of this. We're just trying to be very conscious and intentional about it, to contemplate that God is doing something here. And so if we can be mindful of what is the Spirit simply creating, or what can the Spirit create simply by virtue of my engagement in a dialogue? Just by sitting down with your kid, just by the dialogue, with Jan and her family. What happens, just not even in the content, but just that they sit down with each other, the respect and the love and the witness that comes just from making time for it. What might the Spirit be up to in this situation, and how might or is this dialogue process changing me? And I guess the example I was going to bring to mind, just because I think it would be familiar, it's in that book that I didn't bring up here. Okay, going back to the book, Words Made Flesh. For some of you who didn't have a chance to read it, again, I'm just going to use this kind of in family example, because then we're going to build on that for in culture, dialogues within the culture. The story is about a woman, Kate. She goes to see a counselor because her father sent this letter to her. So real quickly, yeah, page 26 if you have your book. Okay. So the daughter, Kate, she had received a letter from her father, and the letter from the father says, "You have your mother and I very upset." You message, okay? "We haven't slept good for weeks and my ulcer has been acting up." Guilt. "Every time I think about what you're doing, I wonder where we went wrong." More guilt. "Going with that divorced man is going to ruin the whole family." More guilt, fear. "Don't you care about us?" Guilt, fear, sadness, confusion. "It's not that we don't like Tom." "But Kate, he's not for you." Fear, right? "In the eyes of the church, he's married." Okay. "He's probably talked you into believing that it's all okay and that we're all just old-fashioned. You're always together. You can't tell me that nothing will come of it and that it's all innocent." So she's dating a divorced man, or a man who's not, has a divorce. "If you love us, you'll take my advice." More fear, and control, which is usually a form of fear, right? "This is for your own good." Pleading. "Mother and I love you very much." Undoing. Now, everything that you're feeling at my attacking you or coming at you, don't feel that, because it's all because we love you. Okay. It's kind of a dramatic letter. Most of us have learned not to do that, but don't you find yourself sifting through not doing that kind of thing? Right. Okay. So then, because therapy is so effective, on page 28, they've been talking, father and daughter have met, the father's been asked to rewrite the letter. "I have been upset and angry lately." Ownership. "I need to talk about it with you. I'm not going to talk to you. I need to talk about it with you." Okay. "It's hard for me to understand your relationship with Tom since he is divorced. He does seem like a fine fellow, and I want you to know I do like him." Affirmation. Okay. "However, the thought of my special daughter going out with a man who is still married in the eyes of the church is a hard one for me to swallow." Fear, confusion, principles around beliefs. "I just wanted you to know that, Kate. I know that you will do what's best. I see goodness in you. I believe in you. I want very much to understand vulnerability. So let's keep talking about it. You are an adult, and whatever you decide to do, I will always love you. Freedom, encouragement, acknowledgement, confirmation of the forever unity between them. So I use it because it's an example now familiar to many of you, but what would you say is being created just by the fact that the first letter came and all of this is out on the table? What's being created in that tension at the border? New life, new possibilities, space, like the flowers, Space, Freedom is being created. Because when we say, or when I say up here, contemplate the creative process, to contemplate you have to use your imagination. What would you imagine was happening with her when she got one letter and then got the other letter?
Well, the first one would close her off altogether. The second one builds a bridge. My parents really do care about me, and they will at least listen. I know they'll listen if you talk.
Right. So in the dad's work, the daughter not only receives a different loving message from her father, but the daughter witnesses a father's capacity for change. Right? And how a loving parent who doesn't have all the answers is open to growth, and she becomes a different kind of parent then. I always say to my clients, especially ones going through the hard times of divorce, they say, I don't want this to I don't want this to affect my kids. I say, I know this breaks your heart, but you are teaching your kids how to handle suffering and change, and likely they will need this lesson as life goes forward, because no one's really spared times of suffering and change, right? So these are things that we know, that we talk about amongst ourselves, but all I'm trying to do here is say that especially when we go into the public arena, we need to draw on the fact that we know how when we get into conversations at the borders, and we really dialogue with our faith and with each other, we know that the Spirit is alive, changing one, changing the other, changing those who hear our stories. And as we change in those stories, we are part of changing a culture, right? The question is, can we now become more intentional about changing the culture? Okay? I'm just going to add one, go back to that for a minute, but I'm just going to add one of the places where I see that in my own life. Again, I'm just talking about in the small world of family, so we can move to that larger world of church and culture. In my life, I think I shared some of this last year. This is an example of how dialogue goes on and on and on. My mom lives with me. She's 91. If you're around me for 10 minutes, you will hear me say, my mom lives with me. She's 91. Apparently, I'm still making room in my life for all this the last 3 years. But I had a real at-the-border tension conversation with my brother a year or two ago, Christmas. I wanted my brother to stay with my mom so I could go see one of my aunts. And we went up to Chicago, and I was asking for his help, and he could not come for a couple hours to help so I could go see my aunt. And I thought, I'm going to kill him. You know, that's just this I'm going to do. I'm going to kill him. So we were on the phone, and I was saying, you know, could you just come and stay for a couple hours because I want to do this? And he said, well, I can come for an hour. And I said, well, an hour won't help because she's not familiar with the house, and I don't think she should be alone in the evening for a longer period of time at night. We were up there visiting for a week or so. He said, well, Maureen, you know, I'm willing to help, but it's got to be your way or the highway. And he said, I'm willing to help, but it's an hour. And I'm saying, but an hour won't help. We need 2 hours because I don't want her to be alone. And so we're like this, you know, for quite a while. And so finally he said, well, you just don't respect me and what I'm willing to offer. And I said, you know, you're right, I don't. You're right. I said, for me, you don't step up to the plate with what's needed. You will give something, but you won't give what's needed. Well, that, you know how sibling things go. Well, that's your view. Well, that was my view. Well, that was your view. So I said, well, we're just going to have to agree to disagree, you know. And I thought, I'm done with this. So we hung up, and I'm sitting there trying to think, what am I going to do? And then it starts, you know, that good old Holy Spirit who gnaws at you, you know. I said, I have no idea how to resolve this. No idea how to resolve this. I don't want her alone for 2 hours at night, and you don't think that I think your contribution is good enough. So this was truly the work of the Holy Spirit. I called him back and I said, I have no idea what to say. I have no idea what to say. I only know I love you and I don't like that we are in tension. To which then he said, and I said, I know you're trying to give something. I am just too anxious to leave her for this amount of time. And he said, you know, I can't love her the way you do. And it's as if, you know, all new pockets opened up for thinking about what his life is like, what's going on with him, knowing what his story has been. And I said, I know you can't. At another time in my life, I would have, you know, tried to challenge that. I know you can't. I said, but could you love me? I need that help. And so we worked out something. But I remember, and I told somebody this, I remember as we were going up to Chicago, I could feel the tension, the distance, not the tension. The tension was distance growing between us over the years. And I prayed that God would do something. And so while I'm in the middle of this conversation, I'm thinking, oh, this is what you're doing. This is what it's going to look like. I kind of had something different in mind. I kind of had the idea that we would get closer. It would be this kind of sweet embrace, you know, where it came through like this. So I repeat that story because in a way I want to build on. And so, you know, the tension continues. And again, y'all have stories in your families in life where you keep, the dialogue continues, right? So I come back and I'd like more help. And now I've wrestled over the years with friends who have been friends for years who, now that my lifestyle has changed so much and I can't participate, I don't see them. And I talk about that. And it doesn't seem to change anything. Then I have to work through all my anger and my sense of abandonment and all of that kind of thing. So a couple weeks ago, or a few months ago, I had a little party at my house for an anniversary. And a woman that I've known for years and think the world of, she came in because of knowing the people who had the anniversary. And we were in the kitchen cooking and all that. And she said, well, how's it going? You know, how's it going with your mom here? I said, good, you know, a lot of good things have happened. In a lot of ways, I know it's just a lot easier than other people's situation, and I'm learning new things. And I said, what's hard is that you get more isolated. Just get more isolated. And she said, yeah, I know what that's like. I said, well, tell me more. Tell me more. And so she's told me, I knew that she had had a child who had died like 30 years ago. And she said, you know, I live in San Antonio, and I was very involved in my parish and active and all, and my 6-year-old was diagnosed with cancer. And the only place to take him 30 years ago was MD Anderson. So I drove from San Antonio to Houston to MD Anderson every week, sometimes twice a week, with him for treatments, and we would drive home. And she said, it took a long time, she said, to wrestle with the fact that all the people I'd known in parish, nobody offered to come, nobody ever rode with me, nobody made the time. And she was saying this with no emotion. She was telling me a story that had happened in her life that had influenced the wonderful, gracious woman she had become. And so the dialogue between stories. So I tell her my story, and sometimes we tell our stories with a little bit of embarrassment, like we're supposed to be further beyond it. Then it invites someone else to tell a story. And then as I thought about it, this touched me so much, I thought, so maybe that's what the Lord means when he's asked, who are my brothers and sisters? And so through all this, I can see how the Lord is changing my understanding of who are my brothers and sisters. And the first stage is, good, I didn't need those other ones anyhow. No. When we are being changed, there's often layers of reaction, right? And then, as time has gone on, I've thought, the brothers and sisters of some people, like who in San Antonio, other places in the world that I don't even see, like Father Ben lives in Taiwan. I don't even see him, but he is my brother, and how he's living his life helps me love my brothers, helps me love my friends, sisters who have changed in the way they relate to me. And so you could all tell a story like this, right? But we're your own stories of how inner dialogue, dialogue with others, how the dialogue keeps changing. And my point is just to say, our contemplative eyes have to keep paying attention and honoring that God is creating something new. And I know that for many of my friends, and some of whom I don't see as much anymore, the big struggle for them, because I've talked to one or two of them about some of this, that we don't understand keeping your mom at home. That's nuts. When I brought her here, the first thing they said was, is she going to St. Dominic's? I said, not if I can help it. Now, sometimes I want to say, you're going to St. Dominic's. No. It's as if the culture of people I love, and I am oftentimes, I'm sure, part of the culture that's not being supportive of a gospel value. But what I found is that some of the non-participation or connection with some people is, my life doesn't make sense. Then I have to ask myself, does my life make sense? Okay? And then I say, it doesn't make sense because some of it is countercultural. And so my whole point in telling the story is to talk about how the individual always becomes cultural in some way, shape, or form, because how we're living our life challenges certain mindsets. And if we become more aware of that, we realize that when we move to the public arena intentionally, we're just trying to do what's already happening in our lives. Does that make sense? Okay, so the next slide. Some of you might be familiar with Sister Donna Markham's work. She has a book and a whole wonderful way of speaking about organizational change called spirit linking. And one of the reasons I like this term is when I've always thought about going into the social arena and dialoguing, I always think of social justice. Now, what happens in our parishes in a group when we talk about, let's get involved in social justice? And part of it, I think, for me, has been the word that justice sometimes talks about, something's wrong, I'm going to go make it right. Okay? I love a little bit of this shift, and I think this is part of the power of and the influence of the Center for Faith and Culture, is that it's about social justice. But more of an umbrella is it's about spirit linking. It's about taking what we do in our personal, familial lives of listening and dialoguing and shaping culture and become intentional with all those skills and attitudes into the public arena and recognizing it as just another set of relationships. Social renewal is just another set of relationships, taking what we're living in those smaller arenas into the larger arena. Donna Markham says the current cultural forces necessitate a reintegration and a reimagining of a holistic view of the spiritual life, which includes the social dimensions of faith. Okay, it's that time. We all say this in our parishes. Faith is not private; it's public, right? It's just another way of saying that same thing. And so she says a holistic view of the spiritual life means we must bridge. There, we're at the border. We must bridge individual and communal, personal and public, persons and groups and cultures. So everything you know, what Father Nesty is saying, but again, it's just trying to highlight, how do you do that? By doing what you do well, listening, dialogue, reflecting on the creative work of the Spirit in life, and making that the norm for participation in the public arena. been. So what we're doing then is then linking our commitment to that intra and interpersonal dialogue, to dialogues with groups and cultures within the boundaries and at the borders. Because I was thinking about y'all as a group, and I was thinking, you know, I know a lot of you, and I know the great work you do in parishes. I know you dialogue now with groups. I know that you listen, go back and forth, try to understand, do creative things. So again, I know you do this. What I think this whole mission is about is, again, doing it intentionally at the borders. And when it gets to conflict, to not forget everything we're living in other places in our life. And to bring everything we're doing at the other places in our life, in family, in those places where we share bonds, where we think alike. You sit down with your staff, or you sit down with parishioners you really are in sync with. You sit down with people who have your same political views, and it's kind of easy to have a dialogue, right? And it's easy to think, what is God doing, and what's being created, and oh, our social justice committee is doing this and this. It's when we move to the border. I remember when I was working at St. Cecilia's, which was a great experience. But the Social Justice Committee, we had the cards or petitions asking the president to reconsider amnesty for the undocumented. This was like a year after September 11th happened. And our pastor, Father Johnny, gave this wonderful homily. And then people would come out of the church and they were going to sign, if they would, the petition reconsider amnesty. And so a couple of parishioners came out after this fabulous homily. We thought, oh, good, people are going to be on fire. And this guy came up and he says to our Social Justice Committee, what is it about illegal that y'all don't get? And so someone on our Social Justice Committee says, well, what is it about the gospel that you don't get? Okay, we did great when we were in the bonds of like thinking. We really listened to each other, and we supported each other, and we came up with the idea of the amnesty, but take us to the border and we're ready for a fight again. And I was saying to like one of my committee members, no, remember what we talked about nonviolence, and what we talked about, you know, we're trying to build the bridge kind of a thing. So that's all I'm saying, is that we know these things. Can we take them to where we're different? And not just because we have to, but because we want to. We want to be at the borders, because that's the places people stay away from. We stay away from where we're different, or when we get there, as Father said, when we're taken there, we forget all the good things we know about good dialogue that we learn in our families. Okay? So dialogues as Catholics with the cultural voices. That's where we're going in the integration of this work and what the work of the center about is. So it's, you know, what is our Catholic belief, and how do we joyfully go into opportunity to dialogue with immigration reform, with those speaking about capital punishment that are contrary to our thinking, to those who put technology as the primary way of relating, those who believe in euthanasia. What happens when you see about a state that's passing a law for assisted suicide? What's your reaction? You can't even speak, you're so appalled, right? You just shake your head. We have to get past being appalled. No, we have to be appalled. And then we have to take our appalled self to the border and know how to talk about that, because the Spirit is calling us into dialogue with people of a different mindset, calling us into dialogue. Just all the way we think about this Christian stimulus for a new American order. Okay, I know you're about ready for a break. So this is going to be our exercise after the break. So we would like to, at each table, pick one of those social concerns that we put up and ask yourself, as a Catholic voice sent out into the world, we would like you to consider what a dialogue with the culture, when I say the culture is people, right? And we are part of that, but for lack of a better way to name it, what might it look like or sound like on one of the several social issues we've identified? So we're going to ask one table to take the issue of immigration, one to take the issue of euthanasia, one on capital punishment. We're just going to do some practice of what does it look like to talk. Yeah, well, we're going to do that. We'll come back from the break in a second. Okay, and here's the process. Ben, the next one, please. This would be the process. You take that theme, that social issue, and ask yourselves at your table, what would those who share Catholic light post on this issue have to say? Okay, what are the bonds and the boundaries? We're going to practice one of these in a minute. What seems to be the cultural voices around this controversy, conflict, or creative tension? What might the Catholic voice, or why might the Catholic voice find it difficult to listen to our brothers and sisters on this issue? So no, we, them. Try to keep the we. What is the underlying reasoning in their position, and why is this group so passionate? It's the tell me more question, okay? What might this group want us to understand, okay? Then, what might the Spirit be trying to create through, as Father Nesty talked about, continuity with our history, but something new with novelty. Continuity and open up to newness, huh? And how might the Spirit create us anew as a church in and through this dialogue? Now, here's a for example. Let's take the issue of same-sex marriage. Okay, let's just walk through one. So we've got all sorts of legislation going on and being pushed back and forth and in and out, and it's a law, it's not a law. There's a lot of energy going on around that in the church and especially in the country, okay? So what would those who share the Catholic light post, the teachings of the church and the beliefs on this issues have to say? What's the Catholic thinking on same-sex marriage? So that the union and the sexual union between a man and woman is for the purpose of love and procreation, right? So same-sex marriages don't fit the Catholic worldview. Could you name anything else? Right. So first it's about union of man and woman, and the love and intimacy is to be open to life. The other is we believe that that's the basic structure that makes for a more stable society. So the scripture, it's not only church teaching, but there's scriptures that we refer to that present that as a picture, and there are scriptures that also seem to challenge and confront an immorality of same-sex union, right? So those would be some of the light posts. Anne.
This is sort of a background issue, but I have found it helpful in discussing this issue, is the fact that the church doesn't judge the person because they have homosexual
oriented.
It is, as many other faiths do, they say this is a choice, but the church doesn't say.
Right.
That's a background issue, but I think it's important to the conversation.
It is very important to the conversation because it moves, it says what the Catholic thinking is, not just on the choice and action, but Catholic thinking on the person. So it's very important.
But it's really important here to adhere to the authentic central teaching of the Church and not some recent developments that cause it an intrinsic fault. And to my naive theological thinking, that's not infectious, so I agree with you. But there are many people who would say that it is in fact church teaching. That church teaching does. I mean, this is a whole controversy about homosexuals. Can they become seminarians, even though if they're totally chaste and celibate? So I think it's important for us to understand our true boundaries, what the true magisterium teaches, and not one particular branch.
Okay, fair enough. Elizabeth?
Everything that's surfaced so far has been, from what I would wager, we all are probably not in favor of same-sex marriage. But we also should look at what Catholic principles as far as social justice and equal treatment of people, what Catholic teaching would have to say about that, because that's where they see us as not being true to our own principles. And the laws, as I understand it, a lot of them revolve around wanting benefits like tax benefits and insurance benefits. Those are the kinds of social justice things that we would say we shouldn't be able to discriminate about. And yet their response to us is, well, why do you want to discriminate against us?
Right.
Look at it both ways.
Right. So we're bringing out how the Catholic position, there are different aspects of the position. There's the identity, there's the being, there's the lifestyle, there's the treatment, the practice of justice. Okay, so there's all these pieces, right? But doesn't it kind of just highlight for us that when we go into the social arena, what are the bonds? What do we as a Catholic voice believe, and where are the boundaries where we've got some fluctuation in there, and how does that boundary change between persons? And I mean, I hear people, and you do too. We went and talked to one priest, and he said this, and we went to another priest, and he said this, and people are like, what to think? So what happens when we want to be a Catholic presence in the world, and we're not clear about our own thinking or the thinking of our group or all the different nuances to an issue? What happens to most people? Sit down. Shut down. Shut down. Isn't that true? Because I think a lot of times we think about, well, people just aren't involved. People aren't involved, but also sometimes some of us aren't involved because we're so confused. You know, we don't know how to get involved. What do we do about that? Father.
How do you respond to somebody who comes to you with homosexual tendency and tells you, I'm created in the image and likeness of God? Why am I treated differently? I know I have these tendencies. I try to change. I can't change. You know, how do you answer to that need of first being treated as a child of God, and also that struggle of embracing his or her own personality, and try very hard to live up to the teachings of the church and the teachings of the gospel. But every time he or she does that, it's pulled away because, you know, there's an inner, I don't know how do you call it, but
Suffering.
that pulls them to that lifestyle.
An inner inclination, an inner orientation, and inner suffering. But it's really kind of a pastoral care. I'll hold that, and so I want to say something about that when we come down to the end of this, because you just brought in another piece. If we moved on and we say, gosh, why is dialogue in the social arena so difficult? Why is changing culture something that we're not more active in sometimes? And part of it is we're wrestling among ourselves. But remember yesterday when we talked about the babbling and the breathing, that in the two counsels, I have to be right, and in the breathing is, I'm still learning. I don't have to have all the answers. And so if my lack of certainty or clarity, I think, is a reflection on my worth and my being, I'm going to have to wait till I have it all figured out before I'm going to go talk about that, and it ain't ever going to happen. Right? So it's about learning to participate and to go into the conversation saying, this is what I know, this is what I don't know, and continue the process as you meet and dialogue with the other, that you will continue to dialogue with your church, and that somehow all the dialogue is being influenced. But I'm going to come back, Father, to yours in a minute. So that's what it might mean in terms of this how-to of dialogue. What do I believe, and knowing that we're not ever going to have full clarity, but there's a certain clarity that the church has, and we, as in our own identity, need to know that. Then we move on to, well, what do the cultural voices around this controversy or conflict or creative tension have to say? This is an example of what Jeff said the other day. Going and looking at, why do people think what they think about abortion? So what do you hear? What do you hear? What do you read in the media? For people who are for same-sex marriage, what do you hear?
We're not all on the same page either.
Very good point.
One thing was, this was an interview with Elton John about his life, and he said, I don't want any legislation passed on that, that. So I'm not in favor of same-sex marriage, so I don't want that defined as marriage, but some type of legislation that does, protect certain rights of a same-sex couple in terms of, legal things, for instance, with various things like
Health,
estates,
yeah, right. Healthcare benefits,
that to be defined as marriage.
right.
So I thought, well, okay, his perception or his thoughts probably represent a number.
A certain portion.
That way too.
Okay.
And that be something that he would say would be more of a.
Right. So, Chris, you're reminding us that when we talk about cultural voices, that they are, in fact, voices, just as Catholics kind of have certain beliefs, and then there's a range of things they're not as clear on sometimes, maybe not in terms of church teaching, but in think and practice. So is it true of the other, who we are trying not to call others anymore, but trying to call our brothers and sisters, So what else? Bill?
The movie Milk.
The movie Milk. That's what is loud in the culture.
The culture of the other culture has in mind. See the movie Milk.
Okay. All right. Okay. You want to say any more? Just going to leave that.
I'll leave it there.
Okay. Typical psychiatrist. Just throw that. I'm going to go see that movie now.
Well, I am the mother of a 29-year-old gay daughter, and so I see it as a parent who wants her child to live as fulfilling and loving a life as she possibly can. So you kind of have the same dreams and hopes for your child that you do for any child. And so that's the cultural voice that I am.
That's wonderful. I'm going to come back to what you said when we get to number 3. Okay. Father? So the whole message of rights and entitlement is, you're saying, a motive for people. See, the thing, we name all this because that's what we have to get in dialogue with. We don't say, that's nuts, I'm entitled to that. So that's how you think. Tell me more about that. Yeah, tell me more about that, Dominica.
That none of us really have a choice of who we fall in love with.
Yeah.
That it happens.
Right. They're expressing a lot of times, this is a desire that comes to me. I didn't choose it,
Marriage is understood between one man and one woman is strictly a faith position based on Scripture, and it really doesn't relate to anything from reason. So people of belief can believe that, but that's only cultural, a cultural kind of embodiment of a particular period. Now we understand things differently. We aren't people of that belief. Therefore, we have to look at this thing differently.
So not in dialogue, some of what here is not in dialogue with the faith perspective or history even.
That's correct.
Okay.
With respect to our churches, I think offhand, we need to be welcoming to all people. And this means offhand that they need a spot themselves in order to experience their worship. They need to have this contact with God through a church setting. That's, I'm sure, is meaningful to many of them. They want that. And we have to provide that somehow or other. And it's tough trying to get the whole church, the whole congregation, to be welcoming. We need to work on it.
So you're into the response. We just kind of stay then too with what's the controversy. You're saying part of the controversy is that people don't feel welcomed, and we as church need to give a sense of hospitality regardless of what one's thinking is. One more, then we're going to move on.
If we are to dialogue truly with all the cultural voices, and that's the most difficult, we need to listen to the radical voices with whom we think that we have nothing in common, who are actually in our face. Folks who go to St. Patrick's Cathedral and shout because of their anger at the church, what they perceive, or people who have a gay pride, in fact, gay superiority agenda. And I think that unless we actually try to understand people that really tick us off, we're not going to have dialogue. Because it is relatively easy to go from a social justice perspective to other, what we call civilized people with a social justice agenda on their side, and we agree on 85. What about trying to understand people, which is extremely difficult for me anyway, who actually disagree with about 85, 90% of what I believe in, and yet they are cultural voices. And I may have to, at the end, just agree to disagree, but unless I'm willing to hear them, and I don't mean accept them necessarily at the beginning, but that's a voice. That's a valid voice in that community anyway.
Right. And just to pick up on the last thing you said, unless I'm willing to hear them, the Spirit doesn't have big shadows to move in. Because even if, when all is said and done, we don't come to the same thinking, we will have been changed in the process, right? So just moving along then, so we know we need to have some sense of what our beliefs are. We need to say, what are we hearing, knowing that we're never hearing the whole story, and that there are many different voices around a theme. And why might the Catholic voice then find it difficult to listen to our brothers and sisters? Why is it difficult to listen? Why do you think for the Catholic voice, and I know there's a lot of variation within the Catholic voice, why is it difficult to hear people say, it's our right, it's our entitlement, we can't help who we fall in love with, it's about justice, benefits, so we can probably hear some things better than we can hear other things, huh? So you're back to part of the Catholic thinking is how the lifestyle affects society as a whole. And so you're saying, that's why it would be difficult to hear. We're trying to think about the common good. But you get the idea. The important thing is to be able to say there's movements in the dialogue. Knowing what you believe, a good sense of that, trying to know what others are saying, trying to know why they are saying it, what's important. And coming back to not only individuals inclined to same-sex unions, but parents and families. They want us to understand we love these family members. We want them accepted. We want them to have a place in society, right? Things you kind of know, but it's the idea of saying the process is to think long and hard, to take in and sit with, to give time to the Spirit to help shift us in new ways of thinking and loving, new ways of loving. Adam?
I was just going to add, agree that maybe one of the reasons why I think this issue, why it's difficult to listen, is it strikes me as I was listening to this that we're using in many ways the same language, even though you brought up the idea that not everybody wants it for the same reasons, and that's true. But there are those that would say, well, we have the right to love whomever we want to. But I think that one of the reasons why it's difficult to listen is because we hear words that we use. Love. Love your neighbor. Love God. Love your spouse. And to think of that word, love, another, someone of the same sex, it's almost like it throws dirt or sacrilege onto a word and its meanings that we find so sacred.
Right. Yeah. So
it's hard because you're hearing the same words.
Yeah. So we hear the word like marriage, and we say, well, that's not marriage. Marriage is covenant. That's not. Well, no. What we mean by
images of something that is within our boundaries.
So it's hard to hear. It tampers with things that we hold sacred in the image that we have. Jeff?
I think also it's hard to listen or to hear sometimes because we get the false impression that listening, hearing, accepting, loving a person is implicitly saying, I agree with you, or is implicitly saying, I am legitimating your choices. I'm saying that what I disagree with, I now agree with.
Yeah.
And when in fact that's not what it's doing. Hearing is just that, hearing.
Right.
It's not necessarily agreeing or legitimating.
Right, so we can sometimes be fearful to hear because we're afraid that it becomes an automatic affirmation of a decision rather than we're doing this to be in relationship, to be in a love relationship, to see what the Spirit could create. So what we have to do is clarify where we are as we also take in. Yeah.
I think another thing, especially for Catholics, is that we are such sacramental people, and we look at marriage through our lens of sacramentality.
Mm-hmm.
And frequently someone says to me, "You just believe that because you're a Catholic," and I say, "No, I believe it because, but somewhere in my being, it really is."
Mm-hmm.
You know, because sacramentality is a part of my life, and when you talk about marriage as a sacrament, sometimes the whole, that's what annulments go back to. That's what all that kind of thing goes back to. So we're so imbued in that that it's difficult for us to hear people saying something different, about what marriage is to them, because it really doesn't make sense to us.
Right.
At least I honestly
Yeah.
should say.
Yeah, but going back to kind of imagining the work of the Spirit. So if maybe you've done this, but if not, you imagine. I'm closing up. That so you say that to someone. So you're with a group and you say, "Well, my struggle is my deep belief in sacramentality and what it means," and then you engage them in a whole conversation about sacramentality. You think, "Now, where's the Spirit going to take that?" You may become even stronger in that from having articulated it. Others may learn, or you may be challenged in your understanding of sacramentality. I mean, all I'm saying is you're opening up. You're not changing what you believe. You're opening up. We're not changing the light post. We're bringing the light post into discussion. And we have lots of light posts that have changed over time. We have ones that have changed back, right? And so all of this is really about just trying to support each other to moving into the public arena in the kinds of conversations we know you have to have with family. So then we come back to that contemplative stance. So what might the Spirit be trying to create here, and being ponderous about that, and how am I being changed through the dialogue? And how can the church. So those are the questions that we would like you to apply to the different social concerns or cultural voices when we come back after the break. Okay? Thanks for sitting with the details of this. All right, take a 15-minute break. Thank you.